much. It's really
Glad
good
to
to
be
see
here.
you. I'm glad we could put it together on this cold and wintry day. And you in the audience, welcome very much to Conversation. We have a guest that I'm very happy to say is part of the team or producers here at MNN, where he and I met. And he's also an autodidact, I think it's fair to say. We'll find out in detail. That is, he's a very much of a self-taught and self-motivated, intellectually interested person. And he is also the executive director. Julio C. Nunez is, of course, his name, and he's the executive director of the Immigrants' Lives Oral History Project. He's the author of a book, a study, Dominican Utopia, and parenthetically, he was. We got together because he had called attention through his own investigation, his own intellectual curiosity, to a major work back from 1958 that was endorsed by maybe America's preeminent, in the minds of many, philosopher, major intellectual force, that being Mortimer Adler, who gave his prestige and thumbs up, as it were, to a book that was done called The Capitalist Manifesto by Louis Kelso, which I think has great relevance to the current situation, the human condition. We're going to be talking about all of these things. And Julio, welcome very, very much to Conversation.
I'm glad to be here, Harold.
We're taping on the 17th of December to air on Christmas Eve. And so welcome very much to this. Julio, maybe you could, for me, share your background,
Sure.
you know, born and raised, that sort of thing.
Yeah,
and we
sure.
can talk about these other matters. But I really enjoyed our half-hour conversation we had the other day. But share your own personal background.
Well, I was born in the Dominican Republic, and I came here on January 7th, 1969. Came with the rest of my family. My father had come here in 1962, and typical story of an immigrant who works here and then sends for his family.
Right.
I went to public schools in New York City, in Manhattan specifically, and I went on to college at Colgate University, where I majored in philosophy with a concentration or a focus on linguistic analysis of the 20th century, mainly British thinkers.
Very interesting. Let me get your father was what? He was intellectually inclined?
My father was actually involved in politics back in the Dominican Republic, which I think can explain a lot of what I've done subsequent to his death.
Okay, because you're interested in politics as well?
I'm
and
interested
a larger context.
I am interested in politics because I am concerned as a citizen. I truly believe what Lionel Trilling, I believe, said about the moral imperative to use one's intelligence. One cannot simply take for granted what it means to live in a democracy.
Yeah, right, thank you.
You must really become concerned about how it is that society functions, how power is exercised, and you must become involved in the process of bringing democracy to fruition in as much as you can do.
If you want to be have a influence and significance to the condition in which you find yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's intellectual responsibility.
Exactly, and I think that looking at it from a philosophical point of view, many people who go into philosophy and perhaps end up studying existentialism, for instance, are so concerned and focused on their own experiences as individuals that they forget the larger context, the social and political context in which they live. And I think that's a mistake. And so I, from a very early age, have always been concerned about the underpinnings of the political system.
Okay, that
the theoretical levels.
The political system and the intellectual thinking and the theoretical understanding that informs the economic profession, let's say, or economics, which in turn mightily informs the entire political process. The political process is within a larger context. It would be good to be able to have a comprehensive understanding of things, if one can, in terms of understanding things in a systems way, to where maybe even you get to the point where you could see Gaia, or that we're all part of one system, and be able to see things instead of reductionist and specialized, in a comprehensive pattern is something I guess you'd sign on to.
I agree. I agree
Yeah.
wholeheartedly. And I think that it's unfortunate that we have such ignorance in general about the basic thinking that has gone on about fundamental issues going back to the ancient Greeks, Plato, Aristotle. And I think that the individual has a responsibility to think about what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be a citizen of a democracy in particular, and to see the context within which one develops as an individual. And what you just mentioned about this idea of seeing how one fits in within the global structure of human existence, extremely important, especially in this day and age in which our whole planet is at risk. And I don't know if you want to go back to the mention of Adler and Kelso.
I have no objection to that at all. Yeah.
You were a great fan of Kelso, and I hope we can talk a little bit more about that. But you remind me of the fact that in 1948, just as the United Nations was being established in San Francisco, at the same time there was a great movement spearheaded by great thinkers such as Robert Maynard Hutchins, the great president of the University of Chicago, for a truly global government, until which we will have wars and we will have the risk of destroying ourselves as a species.
He used that language as a species?
Yes.
Okay,
I think you used the word speciation sometime today,
well,
at
I
an earlier
used the
time
word
before we went on the air.
Because I would nest the human scenario within the larger evolution of consciousness or within the larger evolution of material reality.
I agree.
You know,
I agree.
that we're part of an overall system. And I like the Gaia idea that it's all one system. We break it down reductionist for convenience, and it becomes specialized, and you get what is tunnel vision or specialization rather than comprehensive understanding of the patterns that are characteristic of the entire process of which we're a part.
What you just said reminds me of that great Harvard biologist, E.O. Wilson, and his book, Consilience, which is the whole idea of building bridges, if you will, between academic fields and branches of knowledge, which is a great thought. It's of course, the original idea of one of the greatest philosophers of all time, Leibniz, the German philosopher, who thought that there is a possibility, in a real sense, of having total knowledge if you can somehow work with a language that links the different branches of human understanding and human knowledge. And so I think that is one way to approach this Gaia, the idea of this. We are on this planet, and we as human beings share it with other living beings, and must always think in those terms. Otherwise, we are doomed. I'm convinced of that.
That's a very large thing, because to say that we are doomed is something that if we are at our own hands and through the process of our extended conscious capability to affect the environment through tools and technology, make the environment other than a given that is most of the way the creatures of the world inhabit it without any thought to purpose or any of these other kind of higher orders of self-reflective consciousness and so forth, but it gives a great power, and that power can be for good or ill, one would assume. And it seems to me, if I'm not mistaken, that the modeling shows that after about the year 1970, coming out of history, that the weapon systems that had been advanced by the various political leaderships in order to gain advantage over someone else that they could go and intimidate or steal grain and enrich their tribe and nationalism and so forth. The research had been at the service of weapon systems in order to give them that political advantage in a realpolitik kind of seen world. And that those weapon systems now have become, at the level of capability, not something that can be tested, particularly on the germ side and on the wave weapons and other kinds of weapons coming out of black ops. that they've finally reached a point which we had not reached as recently as the Second World War, where we were trying to kill each other as hard as we possibly could, putting full attention and effort of the society, that we've crossed a line where those weapon systems, if they were to be unleashed in a spasm of hatred, all too characteristic of the human historical pattern, guns of August, Barbara Tuchman and so forth, First World War, that if they were unleashed, we now have a capability where if they were unleashed, it would mean the total annihilation of the entire human species. There's modeling that seems to suggest that. I wonder, do you think that's something that may be characteristic uniquely of the time in which you and I sit and talk now, the time frame? Or if it's true, first of all.
I was going to say, I think that that scary fact, it is a fact, that we have now reached a point technologically and scientifically at which the human race can wipe itself out as a result of all these inventions.
We could not, as we can look back in the time that you and I was born and are conscious, as recently as that Second World War, we were impotent in that degree. We were not. We did not have the means. We hadn't developed the means
to make it a fact.
So we didn't have the means. We didn't have the capability to extinguish ourselves. Across the line, most of the studies are, it's around 1970 that those weapons became, with the nuclear and then the thermonuclear, and then there's also biological warfare things that have great killing possibility and so forth.
But I was going to say, Harold, that what that suggests to me, and I agree, that there is a point at which we sort of peaked in terms of what we have reached a point beyond which we can now extinguish the human species. But I think we should see this not as a challenge for us as human beings, because this should prompt us to think more, not as you described it as let me get more weapons so I can take from you what I want. Let us think in terms of how you and I can deal with each other as brothers.
Yeah, well, that's another
humanity, but that should prompt us to do that.
I hear you very clearly, and that's what our leaders of the wisdom schools and all of our philosophers and humanitarians have been saying since Cro-Magnon cave. Let's get along. Let's love each other. Let's be good. Well, we're talking about material reality, a dialectical evolution of material reality that's brought a new existential challenge on the killing or the destructive or negative side, that it would be worth taking it should be made available to the people of the world, the studies. Now, some people will say, we've defeated the Soviet Union, the dialectic between communism and capitalism. We won, so we're okay and we're good, and everybody wants to think they're good. And
that's the shallow way to look at it.
Well, no, it's not, but it's the normal way.
It's the easiest way to do it.
The easiest way, and it's also got great propaganda value, and people are very manipulated, and the media is controlled by people that have power, and they have a power base they want to maintain, and they want to think that they are, forces of good and light in the world. Everyone wants to do that, but Francis Fukuyama wrote a book and said, we defeated the implosion of the Soviet Union.
The end of history.
He said, it's the end of history because the good guys won. That's us. Now, the weapon systems that are species lethal, it would have to be a scenario that could be seen, that it would be the unleashing of the weapon systems of the United States of America. And people say, that would never happen because we're the good guys. That would never happen. We're legitimate historically. We have an avenue to the future, and the thing that we're doing is good, and that would never happen because we're the good guys. If we just got to be careful of the bad guys, and that kind of thing, which has been characteristic of political thinking.
Right.
But the fact is that at a level of capability, that seems to be the case, and it would be we who would be the ones who would deliver the coup de grace in some spasm of absolute unforeseen capability that we couldn't realize.
Right, and I think that what you're actually suggesting is that we cannot become complacent. We as a citizenry must be aware that these things are happening, that these interests in the media, in the industrial complex. They have their interests, but we must be aware of these things, and we must become involved.
We
so
being
that
citizens?
we, the common citizenry.
Oh, okay.
To go back to Kelso and Adler, I think that what Adler and Kelso did in 1958 by writing the Capitalist Manifesto, which obviously alludes to the Communist Manifesto, is basically say, look, you as a citizen of this democracy, where capitalism is the form of economic system, then you must become involved, and you must know how this works, which is great.
Well,
and it's a great calling
well,
for us
yeah.
to getting involved at that level.
Yeah, I think you're right. And Adler was really a major figure. Great books, the Encyclopedia Britannica, and so forth. And he was a major, some people, Bill Moyers did a thing, major American philosopher, and it's a matter that he gives his imprimatur to the ideas contained in that are correct, are notable that he did. And so it's at a theoretical level of understanding economics.
But remember, I'm sorry, remember what Adler's main point that he used to hammer was the fact that it is everybody's business to think about the great ideas. It is everybody's business to really understand the basic and fundamental concepts behind or underlying our system of government. And that we must understand these things, and that there is no elite. You know, it's not these academics that must know how things work and somehow we benefit as a result. We must know these things. And that's why it's important to get back to the idea that, you know, your common citizen must use his intellect, must use his ability to think, to analyze, to question, to reason, and to communicate if there is a discomfort with the things that are going on. And you know, we just went through 8 years of absolute insanity.
It was like theater of the absurd,
And now we have this guy, Obama, who is very promising. But I have a friend, a mathematician, who calls Obama the genius of the status quo.
Well, okay, all of that. I didn't want to get right to that, because I've been watching it very carefully. Alice Rivlin was on, and Jamie, it looks like they're going to reappoint Mr. Bernanke as the chairman of the Federal Reserve and so forth, and he's been all involved in the stimulus package and all that. So I wanted to get to that with the economic thought and everything, and I'm interested because one of the things, talking again, if we could, about the comprehensive take on things, this program is going to follow on the day after ours on Christmas. We're going to have a program with Buckminster Fuller. Buckminster Fuller was a comprehensivist.
Great man.
They couldn't put him into any particular discipline because he was interested in virtually everything in the relationship and patterns between them. That's something that should be encouraged because we've done, it's like divide and conquer. Intellectually, you get into specialization. And the greatest thing that was happening in the political realm, and it was very interesting, CIA, billions of dollars of research, think tanks, all of this kind of thing, taking the measure of things, George Kennan, all of these kind of things, they, with all of their capability to take the measure of things intellectually and so forth, missed in their tunnel vision and in their specialization the downfall of the or the implosion of the Soviet Union. They were caught totally by surprise. How in the heck did this happen? Their business is to know what's going on. They were not able to do it because they were all caught up in tunnel vision and in looking at things and in terms of institutions that the zeitgeist may have been having a larger context that you can only get at by having a pattern recognition of the larger context rather than reifying the established institutions, if you can understand what I mean.
Right, I understand
exactly.
Saw
a thing on the television the other day, yesterday, as a matter of fact, Alice Rivlin, you know, a major figure economically, Jamie Galbraith, the son of John Kenneth Galbraith, they had a thing about Keynes is coming back.
Yes.
And that was on.
Celebrating his...
Right. And so they come up and they're having an argumentation whether Mr. Bernanke should be appointed to a second term as the Federal Reserve Chairman. And Mr. Galbraith, Jamie down in Texas, is saying, well, he was part of the cabal of the people with the swaps, derivatives, and all this and everything, and that it happened on his watch, and we had the biggest meltdown of the situation September 2008, and they had to come in and do those extraordinary measures that the economy wouldn't all fall apart.
Which was still stuck.
Well, yes, that's the point in a certain sense. And Alice Rivlin says, well, we shouldn't put the blame on him because we were all thunderstruck. The same way they were thunderstruck and couldn't understand the implosion of the Soviet Union, they could not. All the economists, billions of dollars, research, think tanks, education, the whole economic community could not understand how the hell that happened, that implosion, what it was. They were totally dumbfounded by it because they don't have a comprehensive view of things. The assumption in my thinking was that the kind of thing that was put forth by Louis Kelso and Mortimer Adler 50 years ago has a kernel of the understanding of an economic theory, not the institution, but the theory of understanding the economics that is larger context, maybe bring in Fuller and some other philosophers and so forth, that would give us some sort of an understanding because they still don't know what they're doing. Is the point I'm trying to make.
I agree.
You do agree.
I agree. It's a way of thinking. Mm-hmm. It's a mindset that must be altered. Mm-hmm. And so long as we have people in power who have this way of thinking, and you know,
that's virtually everybody that's in power.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And just to add to that list of people of power, remember Robert McNamara, a genius with all these details and all these charts with the
Vietnam
War. Yeah. He would come and dazzle everyone with these statistics, but yet he was totally wrong.
It was the
because
fog of war.
He had the folly of not realizing that these people were willing to die for their country.
Yeah.
And so here we have another instance of this type of thinking. These whizzes in Wall Street, and I have interviewed a bunch of these mathematicians and physicists, theoretical physicists down in Wall Street making millions, coming up with these instruments, they call them. Derivatives and whatnot.
Swaps,
that when you analyze them, not even a PhD from Stanford Business School can quite tell what they're doing. And so what happened was, these powers that be in Wall Street in cahoots with those in the federal government, remember the former chairman of the Fed, who said, Greenspan, I made a terrible mistake. Reality did not conform to the theoretical map that I had in my mind, which is outrageous.
He was early on an Ayn Randist, and he was also an admirer, I think, of the Freeman.
Exactly. This sort of idealized version of the way capitalism works, which is idealized. And I agree with you. Kelso and Adler, at a theoretical level, were much better fundamentally. And even now, I think their concepts can be applied.
Yeah, well,
and then these big shots who had all the power.
Yeah, I think we ought to try to be gentle with one another if we can, because I don't think it's enough even to go to just the economists, but it's interesting, you caught apparently the same thing. There's a great deal of talk about Mr. Keynes is back. Exactly. John Maynard Keynes was a giant in terms of economic theory. He set up the whole post-Second World situation, the Bretton Woods institutions and everything. And he also was very knowledgeable when it came to things in terms of economics and so forth. And I want to make a quick reference to it, but get back to what we're talking about. We got to get to the Dominican Republic in your book.
We'll get there eventually.
But he was famous and brilliant, and he wrote a letter to his and relating to the situation we're in now. He wrote a letter to his grandchildren in 1930, and it's very famously seen by much of the economics profession. What we're doing is critiquing the economics profession for not coming up with a system that the future requires, because they're tunnel visioned within the confines of the canon of what's called economics.
Which may doom us to something worse than what we just experienced.
But the point is, John Maynard Keynes wrote this letter to his grandchildren in their maturity, which would be right about now. He was predicting. the future, and he said, you are going to be we collective are going to be confronted with something that's going to be very, very difficult to ingest or take into account. You're going to be encountered by massive, technologically induced unemployment. Okay? The technological means of production, you could read capital instruments, are going to become increasingly responsible on a pattern that has been characteristic of the whole human condition, and those assets are going to be so narrowly held by so few, and the only way you have to distribute income to the masses of the people is through their labor relationship to the productive process. Capital instruments are all owned by a small group, rather like the feudal lords of feudal times, and then there's the serfs, and they're going to have money get to them by their having what is called a job within the economy to contribute to the production, whereas the whole trend of the economy is for capital instruments to become responsible for production, and the 90% of the people, the only way they have to get money supposedly legitimately is through having what they call a job. We see people talking now that you're going to have a jobless recovery. They got a race to the bottom with globalization and so forth, and the basic policy grounding statement of the United States. We had the Communications Act of 1934, communications we revisited with things changing. Basic policy grounding statement is the Employment Act of 1946. We're going to distribute income to the people through their labor. And the progressive communities, if you want to call it that, have bought into a labor theory of value, which informs all economic theory more or less.
Especially
if you look
since
at it.
Marx.
Well, Marx went surplus labor theory
Yes.
value. He said it's all created by labor, and we got this all written into the thinking process, and things like they've been hoodwinked in a certain sense. The progressive community with this idea about how much the work ethic and all the values you have of that kind of thing, and you can pull yourself up and that sort of thing, and they've not been able to. It's okay for some people to own everything. We don't have to. It's an evil institution or something coming out of Marx.
But this is the
left.
way it is.
But that's the way it is, and it's very good for those who are in that position, because it makes them totally ineffectual as having a solution when it's the capital instruments that are creating the wealth. They ought to have some ownership of that,
which is the great insight
as
by
the way
Kelso.
for them to get income to buy things that the market is able to produce, and they haven't collectively, and they only have this idea that you're going to create jobs for people, and there's no way that that's going to work according to Mr. Keynes, and we're up against that historically.
I agree.
So you do, and
I
there's
agree.
there's some other thing. I guess you could think about taxing the few people who have all the wealth and so forth, creating the wealth. But you get into all kinds of philosophical things about human nature,
Right.
and all kinds of things that it's easy to hoodwink from the position of ownership of all the assets, like kings.
Right.
Do you understand
And
what I'm
that's
saying?
what
And you have
maintains
to have
the
an
status
alternative.
quo.
You
That's-
know whose fault it is then ultimately? It's the intellectuals for not coming up with an alternative. It won't come out of the business community. It won't come out of the political community. It's all, the established. They're all caught up with reified institutions, reading history, but the intellectuals have not come up with an alternative that is in keeping with the evolution of the zeitgeist and the evolution of what's needed toward a liberation of the human society for people to have income, for them to do what they want to do that isn't tied into their fitting into a job role on some feudal estate, corporate or business.
You put it beautifully. You know, this is the end of 2009.
Yeah.
In 1982, Louis Kelso and his wife Patricia, whom I'm sure you met,
Yes.
wrote this article, a review of the Wealth of Nations, which was basically a rehash of all the thinking of Reaganomics and all that business. And in essence, they're saying what you just said. The intellectuals have either misunderstood what the true nature of wealth is and how the economy should improve, building on Keynes. And the great majority of people have been hoodwinked by this way of thinking. And since 82 to now, we see the devastation that can take place and how people actually, especially so-called progressive thinkers, are totally misleading people because they themselves don't know what the facts are.
Well, it doesn't, if you've got the labor theory of value,
Right.
which informs, it doesn't really matter whether you're Adam Smith or Ricardo or Marx or Friedman or Van Hayek, doesn't matter. They're all predicated upon that idea. And the thing is that idea is not able to serve. You have to have an alternative way. And it's the progressive intellectuals are the ones that are at fault for not coming up because they are not caught within the context of although we do have to anchor it to history, we'll have to keep that in mind, but somebody's supposed to come up with new thinking, and Alice Rivlin, Jamie, everybody's to blame. It's not just
They're
Mr.
all speaking the same language.
And I know a lot of bankers, if they didn't have a derivatives, it has to do with risk in the economic order. It made sense for the derivatives and swaps. They're always in the private sector. It ought to be put within the government or something. It's a thing that has to be dealt with in terms of the larger thing. But the thing is, the intellectuals and progressives don't have an answer. I like Naomi Klein. I've read her book. It's really good. A great critique of Friedman and a great critique of, that and that. But it's not an answer. And the intellectuals, particularly progressive intellectuals, don't have an answer because they've been, well, I don't know, hoodwinked, but we're all caught up on the petard of being caught up in history without coming up with the new vision that is coming out of a context. Probably have to go to things like Fuller and philosophers outside of economics itself. Even.
Expand
or
the
politics,
context.
Or even political economy is too small. It has to be thought of within a larger context.
I agree. And until that happens, we are always at risk of getting deeper and deeper into major problems from which we cannot get out.
That's right. And the major problem would be an unleashing of the weapons that could wipe us all out in a good deal of the biological system.
Or
unique now to these very years in which we're born and raised.
Or the folly of ruining our environment to such an extent that we are not going to be able to solve the problem.
Yeah, but if we can do that, but even if you get down to global warming and you get that's just going to create, ultimately, if you're talking species lethal, there'd be some survivors in New Guinea or something, or Eskimo. So. No, there would be. It'd be inconvenient, as you say, but that could set off political things that's going to set off the weapons. That's what I say. It's the weapons and the destructive capability that is the major threat to the continuation of our species, the things created at our own hands. They got this great movie now. They remake, It Came from Outer Space, or what's the name of that movie that's out now, where they come and they say, we got to do away with this species because the ecosystem's too important in the universe coming from some other system.
This species
you got to do away with
everything.
the species because you're heading for self-destruction. I mean, launch 5 or 6 atomic weapons out of Tel Aviv. Just throw them.
And the whole hell would break loose.
It's not something that has anything to do with rational. It has to be something that would turn us into unleashing it in order for that. So there's that. So, but what you look at in that, you would look at that context of weapons destructive capability of the species. What is equally significant on the existential side? Get out of the economics for a second because it's too narrow. They were all caught by surprise, just like everybody was caught surprised by the implosion of the Soviet Union. The intellectuals.
I was going to say, remember you mentioned Bucky Fuller?
Yeah.
A little guy, a funny-looking guy with his weird way of putting things was more right than all these think tanks and all these very powerful guys in Washington. And I think that's the sort of guy we need at the present time.
Well, his legacy is still here.
That's right.
His legacy is still here, and we're going to have a program that's going to air after this program.
I look forward to it
on Christmas Day without going to that, he did things and everything. He had thoughts. But the point is, what would be existentially as significant on the positive side of the evolution of events in the universe to the existential significance that we apparently now can destroy every single human being in much of the ecosystem with weapons? What would be equally as dramatic as that on the living side or on the positive side that we might be able to try to posit as part of the reality at the level of capability new now that's developed out of the evolutionary process? My contention is we have transcended, think 100 years out, we have transcended material scarcity.
And we're
we
now
can
at what
provide
level?
for everybody. There's no reason for a woman in Japan, in Africa wondering which kid she's going to let starve because there's not enough food to eat. We have a capability, a technological capability to take care of everybody and the ecology through good design. We have transcended the ironclad laws of scarcity upon which all of the historical model is based. So it's a new reality that can't be said. It's impossible. Do you understand what I'm trying to say?
Yes, and so
he
we must alter
up.
our thinking. We must alter our consciousness about the reality we're living in.
I think we had to make a distinction between not the reality. The reality is the political reality, the institutions. Every institution we've inherited out of history
That contributes
have been
to this.
transformed at the level of capability. It's at the level of capability, not reality. People are going to get surprised. How can you say we've transcended scarcity and have 60% of the world's living on $1 a day or something, starving, and so forth, not being served by the institutions or
So
able
you're
to be
suggesting that there should be some type of distribution method or system
No, I think if I may,
so that there is...
For whatever it's worth, I think what they have to do is intellectuals have to be thinking about what's the reality. The reality is things have changed. What has changed that makes it possible for an alteration to where we could live out the dreams that the wisdom schools have been telling us throughout the years, but the political people haven't been able to see? The reality in terms of technology, if we have a system that lets us do what we're capable of doing that we haven't had, if we have that, I think that's the responsibility of the free-floating intellectuals, and they're falling down on the job because they're just picking up. Marxists will pick up, they'll say, it's outdated thinking.
Outdated thinking and outdated methods of communicating things.
So like James Joyce read technology very well. The artists do that. They have that. 1970 was the year when they think they got to the point where the weapons became species lethal. It was the time when Bucky Fuller projected we were transcending at the level of capability. Make a clear distinction between reality and capability. Capability, we were transcending a point where there were more haves and have-nots out of human history. Do you think you could make a projection that through technology where it is possible to project a higher percentage of the world population that could be realistically seen to be, in terms of capability, a have as opposed to a have-not throughout history? Is that a trend that could be almost seen axiomatic?
It could be. It could happen.
Okay, then take that idea and then just project it and say, when did we cross the 50% mark, where there were more haves and have-nots in terms of our capability as the evolutionary process and technological development happened, even before cyber? All the cyber stuff's coming in after. So you get the premise.
That's a good question.
You get the premise, and then you project the premise, and you get a point where you get past the ironclad laws of scarcity.
And so you try to identify that point first.
Yeah, well, you identify that as an equally significant point to the destructive one, and have it become somewhat, once in a while, brought up within intellectual discourse and so forth.
At least considered.
And then you have a thing, within that context, then you have a thing, what kind of an economic system would you set up? And how are you going to distribute wealth? How are you going to distribute income to people if the labor input to the production is diminishing to the vanishing point vis-a-vis capital instruments? And how can we allow to have all the capital instruments owned by a tiny class of people, not well understood by them or anybody else, and that we'd have to have a change in the way in which we're going to distribute demand or capability to clear the market, money to people, by an ownership stake in a technologically oriented productive system. That's what Louis Kelso and Mortimer Adler proposed. And it is looked at, and the progressives can't look at anything that's going to involve something that's going to bring that kind of thinking in. That's why that's probably the most important book in a practical sense, and it's paid no attention to except by Luis Nunez,
Julio Nunez,
who I ran into here, and but it should be understood, or the idea behind it,
right,
and then brought into the thing, rather than them all saying, Alice Riven, they're all saying, we don't know what happened.
Yeah.
We don't understand. We don't have a thing. You understand?
And remember that between 1958, when the book was published, and now in academic circles, that kind of thinking was not even considered seriously to any extent. And therefore, that may explain to a large extent why it is that we don't have that type of book considered and that type of dialogue engaged in terms of what it is that needs to be done to move to a better level of, I don't know, human existence.
Well, it's 50 years ago. That's a mighty long time to wait.
So now maybe it's the time to revive it. And we're contributing in a small way by simply mentioning it.
Okay, who are we going to look for leadership? We're going to look to Mr. Bernanke? Are we going to look to Goldman Sachs? Are we going to look to all the people Paulson, the people that brought it on?
Paulson just died.
Oh, what are you talking about?
Yes.
When?
Samuel Paulson?
No, not Samuel.
You mean Krugman from
no,
Princeton?
I don't mean, no, I mean Paulson, Henry Paulson.
Okay. I thought you meant the
Samuelson.
Nobel.
You're talking about Samuelson.
Samuelson, I'm sorry. Samuelson.
No, Samuelson.
My apologies.
No, he was a Keynesian and everything. No, but no, the people that brought it on,
Paulson is the former
Mr.
Secretary
Rubin,
of the Treasury.
Robert Rubin.
Yeah.
I mean, he's there.
And Geithner?
He got rid of Glass-Steagall. Glass-Steagall. You know, or what is it that?
The Columbia economist.
No, I'm sorry. The thing where they brought the banking, the investment banks, they brought the system into place. They brought in derivatives as a way to dealing with risk within the private sector. They should bring that into a thing within the federal system to deal with economic risk for the whole society and separate out venture and for most people, and then vastly distribute ownership to the vast people in order to give them an alternative way to have income to buy bread and food and everything
instead of
that
simply
they want,
getting a job
rather than
and
having to get a job on somebody's plantation
and perpetuating the whole system.
Yeah, but you see, you've got all kinds of things wrapped up in that. Yeah. You see, it's a huge. It's virtually if you're transcending scarcity in an ontologic sense, in the reality, it questions every single institution and assumption that exists.
Absolutely, and that's why it's so difficult.
When Galileo said we weren't the center of the universe, it played hell on people's identity.
Yes.
Okay? But something like that is required.
A shift.
Yeah. It seems to me, and it would be economics, and you would have to have something that would combine something like what Fuller suggested or others, that something has changed that makes something that wasn't possible.
And we must act on it.
And yes, and that was blowing in the wind. Bobby Dylan said they picked it up. There was a major change going on then, and the political, what do you call it? The
Zeitgeist.
Well, the zeitgeist, yes, but no, the linking to old and well-established institutions and everything that are outdated by that, so that we live at a time. It's almost like speciation. We're coming to a speciation or a new relationship to the cosmos. These are things that are very hard to people get their mind around. And the Catholic Church only let Galileo off the hook about 12 years ago.
But after they humiliated him and had him on his knees.
Right. But anyway, this is the time in which we live. It seems to me a time almost we're coming up like punctuated equilibrium in evolution. We've got quantitative change, and then there's qualitative change. There's something emerged. We're going to come into a new liberation of everybody be able to realize what it is they want to do rather than what they have to do in order to have, compliance with a system that's going to give them a little bread to eat once in a while and maybe a small piece of pound cake on Sunday or every once in a while. So that's all I'm suggesting. And the theoretical basis, there may be others you could link with, but Louis Kelso and the idea of spreading ownership and creating ownership as a way of distributing income is one that certainly ought to be brought up in all political realms. And the economic profession ought to start paying attention to that idea as a way of structuring our institutions.
And it's such a simple idea that
Right.
it seems revolutionary, because simply what you're saying is, let's give people an opportunity to own capital instead of simply giving them a job.
No, yeah. Accumulate capital in a way that the ownership is in the hands of the people, and that is an instrument of getting income to them, the way things are being produced, rather than the idea that they're creating the wealth.
Exactly.
Now, wait a minute. That would free people then to do what they want to do with their life, but still have income to buy bread and food and things like that.
It would be a more efficient way to be a human being.
It would make them liberated from the economic order, and of course humanity never has been. It's always been a few people own and run everything. Emperors in Rome, kings. Now you got bankers, and you got
now we have the 1%.
Now we have the 1% who own 95% of the assets, and they think it's perfectly fine, and everybody say, well, get me a job, please. And Keynes says that it's not going to work because you're going to have self-defeating things that are going to emerge in the economy, because you're going to be confronted with technologically induced unemployment. You don't need them.
Well,
you don't need them as wage slaves. You don't need slaves any longer, but you have to have an alternative way, because they have a very important function of having income to buy penicillin for their babies and food.
Let's make this, if you allow me, if you would be so nice as to do this. We've been dealing with abstractions and theory. When you and I were standing in front of Manhattan Neighborhood Network's building, there it was raining, and you took me outside and you said, Julio, look at this guy. These guys are building this dormitory or whatever it is for John Jay College.
Yeah.
And look at what's happening. Here's this huge machine that's turning the cement. Now, I remember you said, in the old days, you have 50 guys with shovels.
Couple 300 putting it in buckets.
And instead, go ahead. Maybe
you do it. More. I've been talking to you.
And I remember you said, and instead, what we have is one guy that's simply pressing a button here, this huge truck. And back there, wherever this truck came from, is another guy that's pressing a button.
Yeah, but it was up to the fourth floor,
and
they have a little thing they pour the cement into,
and it will go
goes up
through
and it automatically
pipe.
lays the whole floor of cement, and people are standing around
and
with
no one
a flag.
involved, only
nobody
one guy.
involved, and it's all owned by somebody, and they're all holding a flag, trying to get a job holding a flag.
This is Keynes' insight and projection, basically, because what you're saying is what has resulted. You have the technological development to such an extent where the people are sort of...
Well, that's what he projected from 1930.
Totally
Everybody is in the economy. But the economists will all not do that. They get tunnel vision.
Yes.
Caught
up in numbers and theories.
Yeah, well, yes, and they do and everything, and they got their own things. And somebody once said, wars are too important to be left to generals. Economics are too important to be left to economists. And the economists are tunnel vision. Even the progressive economists are tunnel vision by fighting one another. Great critique of Friedman, if you were of that.
Libertarians.
Libertarians, Ron Paul, all of this kind of stuff. But where is, from the intellectual, the poets, the intellectuals? That's the thing that is what we're suggesting, you know. I mean, anyway, I've been talking too much.
No, I think
it's a major thing. I think it's a major problem confronting mankind, that we don't have intellectual comprehensive vision from any of our quarters. We're all co-opted.
I would say your program is called In Conversation.
Yeah,
right?
but it's not conversation. What's happening? Order the book. Yeah, show the book. Yeah, right.
Let's talk about.
Okay.
Well, I was going to say.
We're going
that
too much.
In Conversation is the name of your program, right?
No, it's Conversations.
Conversations with. My program is called The Great Conversation. And I think
it is?
Yes.
Okay.
And taken off on the book by Hutchins. But, you know, I was going to say in response to your prompting me a moment ago to speak, that conversation is not only talking, it's also listening. And what I've done while you talked, is
Ran.
basically, no, listened, and I understand. And if I had major objections, you would have heard them. But in any case, I don't know how much time we have.
We got about 8 minutes.
Well,
so
we can
You got
just
this
say
book
there is
you've
a
written,
link. There is
Utopia Dominicana.
there's a point about this book and what we've been talking about. As you know, Utopia has a beautiful history.
Yeah.
So ever since Thomas More came up with Utopia, and the idea is that you have society, which is a creation of man, and all of a sudden you come across the point at which you question what you have, the reality we're living in. And there may be, you may be unable to, in a very conceptual and abstract way, explain what you think is wrong and propose solutions to that which is wrong. And you're sort of on a creative level forced to go this route, which is through satire or a use of the imagination to sort of do what Albert Einstein did with the theory of relativity. You do a thought experiment, which is basically what I've done.
Okay, with this book.
This book is called Utopia Dominicana. It's in Spanish, and it means Dominican Utopia. And the reason I call it that is because I'm addressing a society that's been in existence for 500 years. Christopher Columbus came to the so-called New World 500 years ago, and where he landed was in the Dominican Republic.
Well, he landed San Salvador first, I think.
Physically, yes, but in terms of where the Spaniards established themselves, Hispaniola. And so here we have, I want to link this to what we were just talking about.
Okay.
Here you have a society that's corrupt, where the abuse of power is systemic, and where you have the total breakdown of institution. I call it the Dominican Republic is a functional anarchy. It functions barely for a certain elite, a certain group, but for the larger society, it barely functions.
For the Dominicans.
The Dominicans. And what happens is that you go there, you go to a beautiful resort, and you think it's heaven.
Paradise.
This is paradise. But that's simply because there's like a ring around the 2/3 of the island that's owned by these multinational corporations, these huge conglomerates from Europe, and they have these beautiful hotels and whatnot. But for the large majority of Dominicans, they're in fear for their lives. And an interesting phenomenon is that even the wealthy are scared to death.
Yeah, right. That's characteristic of the whole world.
Unfortunately, but this is a microcosm.
Yeah, that's a microcosm, and you've written a satirical treatment of that. Do you see it as a screenplay? Do you see it as a filmic thing? What is it? This is all in Spanish and everything, but...
This book is done, it was in it, my original concept was to do a graphic novel.
Right.
Because I think that it lends itself to pictures.
Right.
You see that one of the things I suggest there is no way of politically altering that totally damaged society.
Now, you're talking about Dominican. Do you see this as an example of the broader problem of the world that way?
Definitely.
That's the way it is here, too.
That's right.
the way it is everywhere. But that's the reality, and that's the danger.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think what I loved about what you just said, it was not ranting. What I captured from what you said is that we seem to lack the intellectual tools, or the great majority of those who are so-called intellectuals, the economists, the political scientists and whatnot.
Sociologists,
poets. All of these, they seem to lack the tools, intellectual tools, to deal with that which we need to do to get out of this fix.
Exactly.
And I am suggesting through this book that perhaps the creative way is the way to go.
Okay.
That you must leave this analytical way of dealing with things, and you must go beyond concepts, and you must come up with pictures of what we could...
That's why I said a film.
Pose a possibility. Let's create this alternate reality and see it. and consider it and look at it from different angles. And so that's what I do. As I mentioned to you before we came on the air, this is 42 chapters, and each chapter focuses on one aspect, one institution of that reality.
Okay.
And we must do the same thing, I wish, to the U.S. and the world.
Yeah, okay, that's good. I like that very much. It's the thing, that's a way of getting at it, and the thing is that it's part of a larger context, and that you've done